Welcome to the Business of Sustainability podcast from FuturePlus, where smart businesses turn sustainability challenges into a competitive advantage. I'm Alex Smith, bringing you real stories from leaders who've transformed sustainability and ESG pressures into opportunities for growth, innovation, and a stronger market position. What can the world's highest mountains and those that take on the extraordinary adventure of climbing them tell us about running better, more sustainable businesses? Kenton Cool has spent his career in the mountains, operating in environments where resources are scarce, conditions are unpredictable, and the margin for error is incredibly small. In a world that demands clarity of thought, respect for limits, and trust in the people around you, today, through Cool Company, he brings those lessons into organisations, helping leaders rethink performance, decision-making, and culture in the face of growing complexity. This episode is about using the mountains as a lens to understand sustainability, resilience, and what responsible leadership looks like when the stakes are high. Thank you ever so much for joining us in our little studio today, Kenton. I wonder if you could just give a little bit of background and an introduction to who you are and some of the extraordinary things that you do.
Well, I don't know if they're extraordinary, but thank you very much for having me. Who am I? Kenton Cool, that is my real name, C-O-O-L.
I mean, if ever there was a name to climb mountains by.
Yeah, I'm a professional mountain guide. I'm an IFMGA mountain guide, so there's not very many of us. I think Top Gun of guiding. There's only about 60 active IFMGA guides in the UK. And my USP is Everest. I've climbed Everest 19 times, each time with a client. And my career has been built around the Himalayas. I also co-founded, as you mentioned, Cool Company, which is a performance coaching company. We've developed the 5 pillars of high performance, of which the bedrock, we talked about it earlier before we went on air, the bedrock of which is trust. Trust in ourselves, trust in the process, trust in our clients, trust in our colleagues. And I suppose it's a metaphor, isn't it, Everest? And it can be overlain to almost anything. But today we're looking perhaps more at sustainability and what we can learn about leadership and, as you say, resilience. And I'm not keen on that word resilience. And sustainability from the high mountains, not simply Everest, but around the world.
Oh, we can definitely dig into your thoughts on resilience as we go through. But
it's a buzzword that's been used too much, I think, since COVID.
You have spent a huge part of your life in the mountains, you say. I mean, 19 summits of Everest is quite extraordinary. And that's not, I mean, how many are you at total mountain, like how many summits globally?
Oh my God, I have no idea.
No idea, too many to count.
So thousands, maybe. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it runs into thousands.
And how has your experience about the environments that you've been climbing in over that period of time changed? Is it something that's been gradual or something that you have seen sort of change quite significantly?
Well, I think I'm really lucky. Perhaps we should stick with Europe for now before we migrate to the greater ranges. I think it's changed a lot. It is a simple answer, but it's been quite gradual. And that's one of the really alarming things, because if you are in that environment on a regular basis, you don't necessarily see the incremental change. And certainly, if we're talking about sustainability from an environmental perspective in Europe, the European Alps, one of the things that I'm very passionate about is glacial retreat. And if you go and visit a glacier 2 or 3 times a year, you don't necessarily see the change. And as my career has evolved over time, I spend a little less time in the European Alps because of my commitments in the greater ranges. So when you go back to these areas, all of a sudden that incremental change has added up and you really see it. I suppose the glacier, which a lot of the listeners perhaps have visited or maybe they know of, is the Mer de Glace above Chamonix. And that's a great example because they put a new cable car in. I mean, the irony of building a new cable car to get down to the ever shrinking glacier because it has retreated so much that people were getting cross about having to walk down, I don't know how many steps there were, 400, 500, 600 steps. But as you used to walk down those steps, there used to be a plaque on the steps. This is where the glacier was in 1930. Now, it's very hard for us to get our head around what it would have been like in 1930, other than it's a colossal distance vertically from where it used to be. But then all of a sudden, you go down and it's like, this is where it was in 1960, this is where it was in 1990. And my first visit to the Mer de Glace was in 93. So that's within my climbing generation, so to speak. And I'm going to get the distance wrong. That's still something like 50 meters above, 60 meters vertically above its current location. And then you go down further and it's like, this is where it was in 2000, and then it gets more regular. And it's just absolutely mind-blowing. It's distressing, to be honest.
It's that baseline theory, isn't it, of especially young people seeing it for the first time, they will assume that is what it always was. And, to your point, we have short memories as humans, and the idea of that change, you sort of, you reconnect, you re-establish that's the standard.
Yeah, 100%. I was reading, this is somewhat off piece, but I was reading about fishing relatively recently. And they're talking about fishing quotas and yields coming out to sea through the fishing industry. But again, you say, it's where they're taking that baseline from. And they're taking the baseline from maybe 20 years ago, which was already 80% down on fish stocks. So, it's not looking at the bigger picture. If you see lithographs of the Mer de Glace from the 1800s, it was down in the valley. It was poking its nose. Same with the Bossons Glacier, same with the Lech Glacier, and all of these glaciers. There's not a single glacier in the world which is currently growing. Every single glacier is retreating, and it's easy to. Yeah, I use social media way too much, but I try to use it as a platform. And there's a glaciologist, I believe he's Austrian-based, and I repost some of his work. And every time I post something about glacial loss, there are the naysayers. There are those that will just simply say, well, this is the Earth going through its warming and cooling phases. And I totally understand. I totally get that. I studied geology at Leeds University. My specialism was paleoclimate, paleogeography, paleoecology. So, of course, I know that the Earth goes warming and cooling.
Cycles.
Yeah. But the Earth has never seen an industrial revolution.
Yeah, and the speed of change is effectively the issue. Right? Is that the ecosystems can't keep up with the speed, and so we've always gone through cycles. But
yeah, and I'm a firm believer that there's always an equilibrium in everything we do. Yeah, and if we're pushing really hard at one end of the scale, I've got to be careful now because there's probably some physicists out there, but there's got to be an equal and opposite reaction somewhere, and currently that is to the detriment, certainly of our glacial environments, but more than that is at the detriment of all environments.
With the glaciologists that you've been working with, obviously, their world and they live and breathe scientific data around what is happening, but you also bring lived experience to the table of seeing all of these glaciers around the world, what they're doing and living and working in those environments. Do you find that the two of those things combine really nicely, especially when storytelling and about what is happening everywhere?
Yes, it does. I mean, Duncan Whitley, he's this amazing glaciologist, and yes, he's an eminent scientist. Yet he understands that storytelling, and to a certain extent, shock storytelling, is a way to get your point across. Because on one hand, it's all well and good to say that glaciers are retreating at this rate, or so his recent studies, he's on Everest right now. I will meet up with him in 10 days' time or so. He was on Everest last year. And what they were doing, they were drilling under the surface at about 6,500 meters on Everest into the Khumbu Glacier to look at essentially temperatures, subsurface temperatures. And they are hovering about -3 degrees. And this is where the glacier is formed. It should be significantly more than this. Now, if you just simply say that to an individual, oh yeah, the Khumbu Glacier is at -3 degrees. Everybody's like, well, they're happy days. That's it's freezing.
Sounds cold.
Yeah, exactly. But then I did a podcast up with Duncan, And we're walking back down towards Leeds station. He was going home, and I was overnight and had to do something with the alumni the next day. And he said, let me put things into layman terms. The rate of warming that we see the planet going through, this isn't even alarmist. This is conservative values. There won't be a single glacier left in Europe within 60 years. That's really scary. And that's really scary on so many levels, because we talk about sustainability, don't we? And sustainability is, as you know and the listeners know, is multifaceted. And we're looking at glaciers from my perspective, from skiing or climbing or the mountain activities which we partake on. But what's the knock-on effect to that? You know, what's the knock-on effect to local communities? I mean, we saw the catastrophic mudslide, for want of a better word, on Blatten in Switzerland last year. That completely buried 2/3 of the village. Luckily, I think there was only 1 or 2 fatalities. That village is still under rubble. What do alpine communities start to do in terms of water supply? You know, what do they do in terms of tourism? Because people come to these places for the economic knockback. You know, what happens? You know, and we're not talking in 3 or 4 generations' time. We're talking no ice left in glaciers in 60 years. That's going to impact my grandchildren. They're potentially going to impact my children. I mean, I'll be gone. And I think this is where a lot of the problems come from, because it doesn't necessarily directly impact you and I today. So it's a very easy problem to lose sight of.
It's the next person's problem to deal with.
Exactly. And it's until we can educate that actually it's everybody's problem, not in 60 years' time, is everybody's problem now. Because yes, the world goes through its warming and cooling. We all know that. But as you say, it's the rate of warming. Last time we saw warming anywhere near this rate, it ended in a mass extinction, where 85% of all flora and fauna species on the planet was eradicated. Now, you would have to be quite naive to think that part of that 85% eradication would not include the human species. So where are we left?
Yeah.
It's everybody's problem, not tomorrow, today.
I think it's a really good point. Often when you talk about sustainability or environmentalism or whatever that may be, people think about the actual physical structure or the physical land, which is what it's about. But also what we're trying to get across, and what we talk about quite a lot at FuturePlus, is it's also the impact on us as humans. And we are the people that it is going to affect and impact, and how we exist in that environment. And there are some lovely things that we would miss out on, like going skiing and climbing and being in these sort of, you know, quite exceptional environments. But there is a business impact on that as well, of hotel, you know, tourism. You know, what do ski resorts do? What do hotels do? What do all of the infrastructure that exists around that, the food that is brought, the, you know, how we grow things, where we grow things, how it's transported. Suddenly everything starts to change.
Well, I mean, we will be able to grow crops in the manner that we're accustomed to. I mean, if there's a 2, 3, 4 degree global rise in temperature, all of a sudden the crops that we're currently growing in the UK are not going to be viable. And you know, if water dries up, it's going to become a precious commodity. And that's not going to be available to everybody. You know, it's not going to be in too far in a distance that, you know, the cost of water is potentially going to outstrip the likes of gold. Because I'm going to completely space his name. I mean, the things that we need to survive, you know, it's shelter, it's warmth, it's food, and it's water. We don't necessarily need gold to survive as a human being, or diamonds, or any of those materialistic,
as lovely as they are,
the materialistic wealth that we
yeah.
have. And I know it sounds very futuristic and alarmist, but that's a real concern. And we're talking about Europe, but what about the Himalayas? What about the Indian subcontinent? The huge rivers that so many, tens, hundreds of millions of people rely on for their very existence. How is the Indus and the Ganges and the Brahmaputra rivers going to look like if there's no glacial feed? And what happens then? And that's really alarming.
Yeah. And I think part of that alarming nature is sometimes it feels too big to get to grips with. And I think you have to have sort of stratas of people that go through that knowledge and that information. We need the data from the scientists, as working with glaciologists like Duncan, and the ability to really understand what is that big picture. And then people like yourself that have that lived experience and that can communicate that through to other people to say, look, this isn't an end game. We have an opportunity for this not to be the path that we go down, but it means what we have to do is look after what we've got. And that's both as individuals, as businesses, as organisations, as corporations, as governments, that you have to put a priority on where do we want to be in the future? What do we want that to look like? Going back to Leeds, they wanted a better city centre, so they invested in what that looked like. And I think there's a real story there of all of the importance of all those layers of being able to communicate, look, this is what it could be if we don't pay attention to it. But actually there's an opportunity to make change with what you do, how you buy it, how you work, who you work with, when you work, what decisions, where you put on pressure in order to change what that pathway can be.
I think it needs to come, or at least the everyday person needs to look at leadership teams, and they need to be able to not associate. They need to be able to see that the leadership team is doing.
It's important.
Yeah, I mean, it's all well and good, but I'm not politically minded, but it's all well and good that Labour or Conservatives or whatever your political leaning is, nobody is particularly invested long term, because most, and this is a broad brushstroke, most politicians are only really interested in what happens in order for them to be re-elected at the next term. So they're looking very, very short term. Whereas in reality, if we look at sustainability, environmental sustainability, we're talking 50, 60, 100 years. So there is very little investment, I believe, from leadership teams globally. And if there's little investment from leadership teams globally, it's impossible to expect the everyday person to affect change, because they're just thinking, well, our leadership team is not subscribing to it, so why should I?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that there needs to be absolute, it needs to feel important. And in government or in business of any size, if it's not important to the leadership, it becomes very hard for it to become important to people in the system. I think companies have the same issue as governments do. Election cycles, CEO cycles, average CEO lasts about 5 years. Average election cycle 4 years.
Yeah, 4-5 years, yeah.
So, there's lots of similarities there. The only thing I would just say is that I do believe that stakeholder pressure leads a lot of decisions, and particularly probably in business and government, leads a lot of or takes a lot of leaders into what is important and what should I think. So I think you need a little bit of pressure on both sides. You need people to want it, and you've got to have leaders who can drive it. And you've got to, a good leader will think about it, a great leader, whatever it may be. There's so many long-term or resilient, which we can go back into sort of concepts of, I'm not just doing it for myself. I'm doing it for the longevity of the organisation, of the people that I work with, etc., or the people that have voted me in. And I think there's all things, to your point, have a push, a to and a fro, a push and a push back. And I think you have to have a little bit of from both sides in order to keep that cycle running.
Well, I will name drop here, and I'm sure he won't mind me referencing him. We spoke about him earlier, Richard Walker. Mm-hmm. So the chairman of the Iceland Supermarket Group. It's family owned. So there's no stakeholders as such. So there's no stakeholder knocking on the door looking for their return on their investment. And because of that, that allows, and I'm not saying that they're perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but that allows the company, the organization Iceland, to implement significant change without necessarily, because you were saying that things have to be driven by the stakeholder. Whereas a lot of the time in organizations, big organizations, the stakeholder is looking for their pound of flesh in terms of growth, monetary, financial growth. And I think it was George Monbiot was saying that it's impossible for, he was talking about Western society, but he was saying that it's impossible for countries to have year-on-year growth without something giving. And the thing that gives is the environment, the sustainability of the environment. And you and I were talking before, weren't we, about, it's the most complex Venn diagram known to mankind, and you have to try to find the sweet spot because it's never going to sit in total equilibrium. At the same time, how can you expect a country to have that continued, domestic, GDP going up and up and up without the equilibrium? There's something's got to give. That's the pushback. And that's a societal thing. That's a capitalist society issue. And we all love Gordon Gekko, Greed is Good, the film from the 80s, or is it Wall Street, I think it was. Yeah. But fundamentally, it's flawed. And at some stage in a not too distant future, I think that the planet, the environment as we know it, is going to spiral into a total black hole because we have been removing too much without pulling back.
I suppose it's what, again, it goes back to what do you want and where do you want to get to and how do you view sustainability? If you view it purely as somebody else's problem or purely environmental or even carbon focused, it isn't useful. But if you've got shareholders that want a quick buck quickly, which is part of the problem around, then that's where it often has great attention. If you've got shareholders that are looking for long-term impact and growth of what they're doing, then actually what they want is everything to work. They don't want water to become more expensive. They don't want oil they want cheaper, cleaner energy, preferably over a long period of time. They want people who are going to be able to work for them, who are healthy and capable of getting there. And if you look at actually all of the structures that are required around business and consider all of those within a sustainability theme of social impact, how are we treating people that we work with, that we employ, the communities that we exist in, social license, so to speak. If we look at the environment that we want to be in, we want to not have stranded assets. We don't want to have things that are becoming uninsurable because of where they're located or what they're doing because of potential environmental change. If you look at that bigger picture, then you can start to turn the conversation. If you want long-term secure income, especially for things like high net worth families, generational wealth, if you want to look into the future, then actually what are the things that are going to negatively impact your business that sit around that societal and environmental impact? And what can you do to mitigate that as early as possible? And that does take entire systems, but entire systems all have multiple cogs. And if you get all of the cogs turning at some point in the right direction, then I think, I'm biased. This is what we do. I believe that there can be better outcomes for people over the long term.
Well, it's not working right now. I'm not saying that what you're doing is not working.
I think there's some brilliant examples out there, but yes, globally.
I think the really interesting thing is what we're doing right now is not working. So we have to try something else. And I think that's where you guys come into things. I wouldn't necessarily say it's re-education because most of us have an inkling about what needs to be done. I think most people need help. They need a little understanding that they've got to put in now to reap the reward in however long it is, because this is not going to happen overnight. And unfortunately, to go back to the, I mean, I'm not saying we should all go socialist or anything silly like that, but the capitalist model is, what can I do to benefit me? How can I secure my own financial standing, material wealth, blah 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 blah. Whereas in reality, it should be more holistic. I think it needs to be more, especially with where we're going. We need to look more closely at not necessarily huge financial return or materialistic wealth, but we have to start looking at, this is going to sound very alarmist, isn't it? More about the things which are really important to us. Community, family. Exactly. Where are we going to get our food from? We all want good quality food. Where's that going to come from? And that's something which is a give and take, because the numbers of people on the planet now. So we're a plant-based family at home, for instance. So we don't eat meat, but the majority of people do eat meat. I mean, is that sustainable? Moving forward, without factory farming, and it's, where do you start? God, I feel a bit overwhelmed just saying that.
Well, I think that's a really good point, actually, and a problem that lots of people come across is you get to overwhelm, and then you don't know where to go, so you do nothing. So you do nothing, and then actually nothing. It certainly doesn't make anything happen. And I suppose bringing it back to what you do is that there's that same sort of risk level on the mountain of when you guide people, there must be points there that you, from experience and knowledge of what is possible, can talk to people through overwhelm to make the next step in what they're doing, without sort of trying to really pull the analogy too far apart. But I mean, it's often about giving people confidence and going back to your word, trust, in order to make the next step, whatever that might be, sometimes physically in your case, probably more sort of, less literal in how we work with people, but reducing that complexity down, reducing that overwhelm, and saying, this is what you're going to do, this is the plan, this is the structure, this is our aim, this is where we're going to get to, and this is exactly how we're going to do it, and that's the next step. And I suppose you must have that in a very real sense, in your work when you're with people.
I think you summed it up really well. I mean, it's putting the confidence across to the individual. My work as a mountain guide is, obviously we need to look after people in the mountains, but a lot of people, they don't simply want to experience the mountains, they want to go and push themselves in the mountains, and they might not have the confidence to do that. So it comes down to explaining, as you said, how we're going to do it. We know where we want to go. This is how we're going to do it. And then it's hand-holding to a degree. But that comes from the guide, who is, I suppose you could call it, the leader. So, this is what I was saying earlier. It's got to be, to an extent, it's got to be top down. Yes, of course, it can be driven from the bottom up. And we were talking about Hungary earlier, and you can see, uprisings makes it sound quite revolutionary, doesn't it? But cultural change in Poland or Czechoslovakia, when the Eastern Bloc was beginning to fall down, that was a popular base upwards rather than top down. But I think, in terms, certainly in this country, for sustainability in whatever form it may be, is hand-holding from the top down. This is how we're going to do it. This is why we need to do it. Make it very clear. And arguably, these are the consequences if we don't do it. So in the climbing world, I mean, it's pretty simple. If we don't do it in the right way, we're perhaps not going to gain a summit, or God forbid, somebody gets frostbite or somebody dies or whatever it may be. So from a climbing perspective, and this is, I think, it adds clarity to my thought process, because climbing is very much in the moment. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily looking 100 years' time. It's now. And one of the things that operated in the mountains for the last 30 odd years has shown me, or taught me perhaps, is we are responsible for our own actions, and you have to be aware of what the consequences are. And if you're not willing to accept the consequence, then you have to have a very long, hard look at yourself about whether you should be doing that action in the first place. And if you overlay that into everyday life or even business life, you know, if you're trying to, I'm not going to be able to think of a decent business analogy now, but you know, if you're going to try to strike a deal or whatever it may be, you know, if you're not willing to accept the consequence of it not happening, then you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. I mean, it's that risk mitigation thing. I mean, risk is binary, but risk is black and white, is 1-0. The event either happens or it doesn't happen. There's no, oh, I nearly got run over. You either run over or you weren't run over. Yeah. Now, what leads up to that event, well, that is slightly different. And the mountains have given me this lens. You use that term lens to start with. You know, being in the mountains, being with my Sherpa friends, traveling the world, I feel very privileged to have been able to do that, and being in developing nations, impoverished nations, being in, you know, life-threatening situations, and it adds this crystal clear clarity. It cuts the noise away, and you understand what is actually really important. Mm-hmm. And one of my bugbears when I work with organizations is, you know, and we talked about inclusion, didn't we? And totally, I'm an HR nightmare, because the majority of us are too safe. We're too safe in what we do, in our everyday lives. We're too safe in our job positions. It's very hard, and, you know, unless there's sort of sexual misconduct or, you know, some really big misdemeanor, we're not going to lose our jobs, and we're not going to. So we don't necessarily work as hard as perhaps we could do or we should do. Whereas in the mountains, you don't have that luxury. The mountains don't care if you're an expert. Mountains don't care if you're, you know, they will come and bite you really hard and show you who's boss very, very quickly. And that's very humbling. And to be able to bring that into everyday life is a powerful tool.
I find that really, really interesting. And I feel like running a small business is probably not quite as dangerous as climbing a mountain, but often get some of the same feelings, that unless you put absolutely everything into it and you accept all the consequences, it won't work, and you have to do it. But I was going to ask you a question about failure, because we talk about failure quite a lot with when we're talking to organizations. Well, we try and reframe it as something positive, in as much as it's very hard to learn if you're not willing to fail. Mm-hmm. So you have to give people, to use the term, you know, psychological safety, or the ability to be comfortable to fail in order to do great things, because great things don't happen just once perfectly. You know, generally it takes the work to put in and the understanding. And I'm sure and I was going to ask about that, you know, when you're on the mountain and you're in those scenarios where, you know, the consequences are at the extremes. Have you ever made decisions where you knew that not summiting, or that adding so-called failure into what you're doing was the right decision, of pulling back or changing the decision? You know, you're a guide, you're there to get people to summit, and actually, you know, that's not the right decision to make and it's not going to happen. So how do you, I suppose what the question I'm asking is, how do you view failure, and how do you communicate it when you're working with teams?
So failure has a stigma. I mean, it really does. And, you know, certainly if you're in the US, if you're a business owner in the US, then, you know, if you haven't failed at some stage, you're almost considered a failure.
Yeah, it's the Silicon Valley. Yeah. And surely you're on your third startup.
Yeah. And I think, as you said, is how you frame it. Because for me, a big expedition, success is coming through the door at the end of it. And the summit is kind of an arbitrary milestone along the way. And from my perspective, it's communicating that to all parties who are on that expedition. And once you kind of express that, then it's pretty obvious. This is actually our aim. It's to come home safely, come home as friends, having had a really great time, and hopefully we've gained a summit. And if we don't gain a summit, that's not necessarily a failure, but we can learn from why we didn't summit. But on the other hand, and this is a continued success can breed complacency unless we unpick success, because we're really good at unpicking failures. If this didn't work, why didn't it work? Mm-hmm. Let's look at why it didn't work, unpick it, work out what didn't go in our favor, and let's put processes in place so it doesn't happen again. How often do we unpick success? Let's look at why it worked and try to replicate that. And what we did relatively recently on Everest, and it was a throwaway comment from a colleague, a friend of mine, Lucas Furkenbach, over breakfast in a hotel in Kathmandu post-expedition. He said, "Oh my God, you've done it again. You've chosen the best day to summit. You've got your client up there safely. You've done a really quick expedition. Everybody loves you. You're in the first summit wave, blah, 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 blah. How do you do it?" And I said, "Well, it's luck." He goes, No. Luck is if you do it once or twice, or, God forbid, you manage to do it 3 times. That's luck. Beyond luck, there is something else going on. And that really piqued my interest. So guess what? I went back to Leeds University, sat down with the human behavior team, and we started to unpick what success looks like, how success comes, and what building blocks do we need to put in place to defend that continued success, rather than necessarily looking at failure. Yes, of course, failure is a huge opportunity to learn and to grow and to be transparent and to be honest with everybody, because that's how you build trust. I mean, trust is underpinning all of this. And as a slight aside, I was at the Explorers Club dinner in New York. This is years ago. This must be 11, 12 years ago. And I didn't have any idea who this guy was. This guy called Elon Musk gets up on stage and he presents SpaceX. And I didn't know who Elon Musk was. And he shows the first 3 rocket launches. And they were abject failures. I mean, the first one didn't even get an inch off the ground. It just blew up. The second one, I don't know, went 6 feet off the ground and blew up. And he's on stage and he laughed. And I know Elon Musk is a very Marmite character, and you either love him or hate him. And then he started his presentation by saying, that was the start of SpaceX. Didn't go very well, did it? And now look at them. Yeah. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, that's learning from continued... We shouldn't really use the term failure, should we? But, it's a continuous learning experience. And it's exactly the same in the mountains. We constantly fine-tune by looking at what works and looking at what doesn't work. Mm-hmm. But then the variable is the client, because what works for one client doesn't necessarily work for another client, because we're all individuals. What works in one environment in terms of sustainability is going to have a knock-on effect somewhere down the line. So we may be trying very hard to save the glaciers, but we keep talking about equilibrium, don't we? So if we put all our focus onto one thing, there's going to be a knock-on somewhere.
I think we should definitely find new words for failure and resilience and agree on them at some point
the
before.
The issue that I have with resilience is the issue that, I mean...
I don't disagree with you either.
So during COVID, obviously, resilience became this huge thing. And I do a lot of keynote speaking, and so many people, organisations saying, we want you to come in and talk about resilience, especially during COVID, or on Zoom or Teams or whatever it was at the time. And the thing with resilience is, people talk about where you get knocked down and you get back up again. But how many times do you get up? 5, 10, 15? I mean, until eventually the individual, the organisation says, you know what, I'm not getting back up again. My resilience, air quotes, has run out. So actually what you need the vision. You need to understand what it is you're trying to do. And that's where the empowerment comes from. So by having a vision, by onboarding everybody to generate a culture, a sustainable culture, whereby the hiccups along the way, the potholes, the failures, whatever you want to call them, is simply, is part of the journey. And you don't need to necessarily pull yourself up, because you realize that it's part of the narrative and you have to go through this. You don't necessarily need continued resilience. I mean, what does resilience actually mean?
Getting up, trying each and every the same way every time is maybe not the answer, but learning from it and connecting it to the benefits of failure
agile,
is a whole other
pivot. You've got to, okay, we're trying to climb the mountain in this way. It's not working. So why don't we try something else? I heard this great, he was head of the American Cardiology Society, and he was talking about diet. I mentioned that we're plant-based at home, and he was talking about heart disease in the US. And he was talking about, the current way that we are approaching it, our current diet, considering the level of the heart attacks and obesity and whatever it is in the US, our current diets are not working. So why wouldn't we try something else? And I think it's the same, certainly with environmental sustainability. What we are currently doing is not working. So we need to try something else. What that something else is, I personally, I don't know.
I mean, I might, have some answers if anyone wants to, or at least an attempt at throwing stuff out. But I feel like we could have this conversation for hours, and I would absolutely love to. I think I said to you sort of before we started this podcast, we talk a lot about ambition with what we do. And we think it's, and much to your point of having a vision, we think it's really important to know where you're going and why you're going there. And because I think that really underpins the ability to progress, much to your point. And we speak about that a lot. But I wanted to ask about you and your ambition and how the mountains have shaped it and what that looks like. And if they can't experience what you have by, climbing, summiting thousands of times and experiencing what that's like, what can you tell them about your ambition that they can maybe take into sort of what they're doing in their life? Which I feel like is a really big question to throw at you at the end. So I'm going to apologise.
Well, I mean,
you're clearly very ambitious.
I don't know. I think I'm one of the luckiest people on the planet, because I get to climb Everest not just once, not twice. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be Everest. It could be Mont Blanc. It could be the Matterhorn. It could be Mole Shabbat, which was the first. I'm not even sure you can call it a mountain. It's in North Wales. It's 3,000 feet. So I presume it is a mountain. I've been doing this for the last 35 years or however long it is. And I feel very lucky and privileged to be able to climb mountains and to get a completely different viewpoint on life. I definitely come back from the mountains humbled and as I mentioned earlier, I think with a clearer sense of what's important. Unfortunately, that gets very quickly diluted when you come back to everyday life. But Everest has become a metaphor in recent years, i.e., what's your Everest? And Everest for me is Everest, and that's where my privileged position comes from. I get to see the view, I get to be part of someone else's journey, and it is amazing, absolutely amazing to work with my Sherpa friends, to learn from them. I mean, we want to talk about sustainability. I mean, oh my goodness. I mean, those guys doing what they do, coming from the backgrounds that they come from, the villages that they live in, no cars, no running water, only recently electricity, only recently connected. Yet they are some of the most generous-hearted individuals I've ever come in contact with, willing to share anything and everything. There's a lot of learnings we can come from them. But for the everyday people, if we use, sorry, that's a bit arrogant, wasn't it? But if we use that term, what is your Everest? For me, I think just simply finding something that gives us joy. And, we were talking about Clipper earlier, weren't we? And sailing. Yeah, perhaps it's sailing. Perhaps it's going on a country walk. I mean, all my things are going to be like physically based because I'm not going to say sitting in front of the TV, but because that has a knock-on effect. If you sat there drinking beer and eating crisps, that's not necessarily going to.
It's not necessarily your Everest.
Yeah, not necessarily your Everest, but find something that gives you joy. Because if we're not finding joy in this, and forgive me, I'm not particularly religious, but I do firmly believe that we've only got one go at this thing called life. It's got to be joyous, because anything we partake in, if it's a chore, we're not necessarily going to do it. And when it comes to what we've been talking about, sustainability, be it doing your recycling or whatever it is, it's got to be easy. It's got to be easy for us to partake in it. Once we start doing it, if we find that initial motivation, because motivation is going to ebb and flow, but if we can find discipline, then discipline leads to consistency. And as soon as we find consistency, then we're 9/10 of the way there in terms of keep doing what it is. But it's got to be comparatively easy and joyous to start with. If it's a chore, then we're not going to do it. And whether it's doing couch to 5K or doing your park run or walking the dog, that's where I think people find joy.
I am delighted that you used those two words. The team at FuturePlus will laugh because my word of the year is consistency, which luckily we're both, I think, okay with. I truly believe in consistency to build this discipline. And I think it's something I know, very self-aware, know that I need to do it. But also one of the values we've had as part of the company since the very beginning is that it should be joyful, that what we do should be joyful and how we talk about what we do should be joyful. And because otherwise, I do think it becomes monotony. So delighted that those two words sort of came to be part of it. So we don't have to rename them and we're good to go.
No, we're certainly good to go on that. But I mean, I don't want to labour the point, but consistency, little things matter. Do little things, because the little things, if enough of us do the little things, then they become big things. And we can govern the journey that we're on by doing the little things, but doing them consistently.
Kenton, thank you so much for joining us today. I have absolutely loved this conversation and I'm ready for part 2, part 3 and possibly part 4 as well.
I think we probably need a pizza. Somebody mentioned pizza and gin and tonic. Now that would be a...
that would be a good episode. Good luck in your next trip to the summit. I think it's 20, which is world record breaking, I believe.
I don't believe in records on mountains, but I suppose if we are going to pigeonhole it, the most non-Sherpa summits.
I hope it goes brilliantly. I hope the lessons learned are positive. We wish you all the luck in the world. And if you'd like to find out more about Kenton or the Incool Company, head to incoolcompany.com. For more episodes and resources on building sustainable business, head to future-plus.co.uk. And I'm sure you can follow Kenton's journey through social media as well. But it's been an absolute delight to speak to you today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.